Hello everybody, here a new video from Rene from Spain. And in this video I would like to show some records that took me through the 90s. Because a lot of people on the VC are showing records that made them happy during the 90s. And a lot of the videos I see is exactly what I remember that happened. You know, when grunge came out and later alternative and industrial music got mixed with metal, a lot of people follow those trends because they liked that music. And a lot of the music I'm going to show here was not on MTV anymore and was not really for everybody to grab, you know. Still, I think if you were a fan of Iron Maiden or Saxon during the 80s, I think you would try to follow them a little bit. And those bands were still in the big magazines too, in the metal magazines. But a lot of the metal I'm going to show went underground. I mean, some of it. Some of it didn't, you know. Some of this stuff still sold a lot of copies in the 90s. Because some of these bands, they kept the popularity. During the early 90s till maybe 95, 96, 97. Okay, a good example of that is, for example, Aerosmith with Get a Grip from 93. This had a lot of hit singles. This was all over the TV, you know, the video clips. And of course, this was a very, very big album for Aerosmith. Also, Van Halen, Balance, the last album with Sammy Hagar. And of course this was a big album for them too. I think they sold 5 million copies of this, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe now already more, but a couple years ago I remember I checked it. And this is from 1995. A big album for Van Halen. Also These Days, that came out after Keep the Faith. And this is from 95, sorry. Now also 95. This was maybe the last very big album for Bon Jovi, These Days. You know, a lot of cool songs are on here. Okay, let me go on with some other records that were very popular in the 90s, of course. Especially in the early 90s, we are talking about Guns N' Roses with the Use Your Illusion albums. Super popular records, you know, till 93, 94. You could hear all those songs on MTV every day. Also, this album by Alice Cooper did quite well for him. I mean, I always like this more than the Trash album. It's from 1991. Also, Ozzy Osbourne did still very well with No More Tears. I didn't grab everything of course, I own from the 90s. If not, the video would be even longer. Also, Meatloaf did very well with Bad Out of Hell 2. I mean, that album sold millions of copies in 93, I think it came out. Also, this one did quite well for Motorhead, Bastard. And Motorhead did some great albums in the 90s, you know, they always went on. Also, Motley Crue, of course, released Decade of Decadence album. This is a great compilation with some re-recording songs too. You know, for example, Home Sweet Home, they re-recorded it, especially for this compilation from 1991. And I have a lot of good memories with this compilation. Another very successful compilation was this one by Judas Priest, that came out in 93. It was a big compilation. Also, Halloween actually did a compilation in the early 90s. Talking about Motley Crue before, Vince Neil released this album. That's a very good album with Steve Stevens from Billy Idol fame on it, playing the guitar. You know, it's just very good. If you like Motley Crue, you should check out this album from 93. Amazing record. Another very cool band, of course, that went on in the 90s is Warrant. Some people already showed this in the VC from 92. See? Dog Eat Dog. It's a little darker than the first two albums, but it's like Winger. Winger also released an album called Pool in 93, if I'm not mistaken, and it was also a little darker, but still it has a lot of good songs on it. Another artist that comes to mind is Mike Trump from White Lion. White Lion still did one album in the 90s, in the early 90s, and later he formed Freak of Nature. And Freak of Nature, the first album of Freak of Nature, I loved that album. I mean, it's a little darker than White Lion, but it has so many good songs on it. Of course, Rob Halford went on with Fight, releasing 2 studio albums, but this one is of course the best of the 2. This came out in '93, if I'm not mistaken. Another album from '92 actually is this one from Great White. Also Great White went on releasing albums in the 90s that a lot of people don't know about. They were a super big seller, of course, in the 80s, but in the 90s with all the grunge and all the stuff, people just forgot about this band. Same happened with Cinderella. I mean, how many people bought this album when it was released in '94? It's a killer record. It's such a great album. I love it. Still climbing. Also Slaughter went on with Fear No Evil, and they released more albums. I have them in my collection. Also Bang Tango went on, for example, or Love and Hate went on. LA Guns went on. Not everything was great in the 90s of LA Guns, but this was still a very good album from '91. Crocus went on, you know, the band from Switzerland. This has a different singer. This has Carl Albert, you know, the Persian Risk singer, you know, the British vocalist from the new wave of British heavy metal band Persian Risk. Carl Sentence, actually. Not Carl Albert, it's the guy from Vicious Rumors and another band. I don't remember the other band right now, but I know that band. You see? This. Also they made Stampede. It was also a good record in the 90s. Of course Kiss released this album in the 90s, Revenge. And they released the Cool Unplugged in the 90s too, that I really like. Kicks went on too in the 90s. See, this was their second album in the 90s. I think they released one in 1990 or 91, and this one came out in 95. The Canadian Fist released this in the mid-90s. Fist, Mayo Fist. They were well known as Mayo Fist in Europe, because there was already a Fist in the UK, but these are the Fist from the Canadian Fist. For sure Dan Powers knows this band. Okay, let me go on. Also we have a little bit lesser known bands that went on. I mean, lesser known in the world, because Muro was quite a big band in Spain. This is from '92, a great album, Speed Metal by Muro. Dirty Looks released cool stuff in the 90s. This is one of them in '91. Pretty Mates went on during the 90s. Same as Pink Cream 69 or Praying Mantis, also released cool stuff in the 90s. I keep naming bands because I want to name a lot of bands for you to realize, for the people that lost track of this type of music in the 90s, that the 90s were amazing for heavy metal and hard rock, traditional hard rock. I'm not showing any death metal because I already showed videos about death metal from the 90s. I will put a link in the description to the 90s death metal stuff that I listened to, you know, that you can see. I'm also going to put a link to my 1995 best albums video. It will also be in the link. You see? Pretty Mates. Rage did a lot of cool things in the 90s. For some of the people, they did some of the best work in the 90s. Sodom, of course, went on in the 90s, doing some thrash metal. Of course, you got some newer bands coming out in the 90s, like Stratovarius. Jack Panzer from the 80s. You know, they did more records in the 90s than they did in the 80s, of course. They only did, I think, Ample Destruction and the Tyrant mini LP. But very cool stuff. Jack Panzer did so much for metal in the 90s. Testament. I mean, I love this record. A lot of people thought they sold out. You know, it's like the Black Album for Testament. But I like this album a lot. Also Tourniquet. You know, the Christian thrash metal band did a lot in the 90s. Deliverance too. Eternal X, this is a newer band. It came out in the mid-90s. great traditional metal with some progressive touches too. White Cross did some cool things also in the early 90s. Later they changed style, you know. I still like those albums, but they changed style. But this early stuff is, I mean early stuff, the early 90s stuff is still very good. You know, here, yeah, Rex Scarrow was still in the band here. Also, Bloodgood did a live album in the 90s, and they released this one in 91. When people talk about Bloodgood, they hardly talk about this record. This is more hard rock, you know, it's cool. Okay, Axel Repel, of course, did a lot of records in the 90s. In the 80s, he was in the band STEELE, and then, of course, later, in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, he went on with Axel Repel. And he had a lot of great singers in the band, like Rob Rock, Jeff Cozzotto. You know, it's like you should. And now he has Johnny Gioli in the band from Hardline. He's still in the band nowadays. And this is, for example, from '98. But I could have picked any album up from '98, you know, from the 90s. This is Oceans of Time. See, metal band Chronicle. He showed the other day also a vinyl by Axel Repel. I think it was Masquerade. Pink Remix 69. Before Andy Dearest left to Halloween, they released this. Did I show Halloween already? No, I didn't. Okay. Riot did so much in the 90s. I mean, this album is totally killer. I love this album. Also, this one is cool. And they released only good stuff in the 90s. Riot should have sold so much more, you know, but only because so many people started listening to other type of music. Bands like Riot had a difficult time, but they still released amazing stuff. Halloween, of course, came back with Masters of the Ring. You know, it was a great album with Andy Dearest from Pink Remix 69. And during the 90s, they made great records like Better Than Roar, or Time of the Oath, for example. Manowar, they did very well in Europe. In America, not anymore, but in Europe, they played a lot live. I saw them a couple of times. Also in Madrid, in '93, I saw them. Also, I saw Halloween, actually, I think in '94. It was the first tour in Madrid. But this one, I saw this live in '93, and they were amazing. These guys kept the flag of true traditional heavy metal alive during the 90s. Sinner, another great traditional band. You know, you cannot go wrong with this band. In the 90s, they were amazing. So many great records came out in the 90s. Also, you had some comebacks in the 90s, big comebacks, like the Merciful Fate. They came back in '93 with In the Shadow. You see, they came back with these records, and they released more records, of course, under the name of Merciful Fate in the 90s. And also King Diamond, he was strong in the 90s. Or Running Wild, Saxon. So many stuff I don't show in this video, but I want to mention it to you. I want you to get in your brain. You know, everybody that thought that the 90s were not good for traditional metal, it was great for grunge, great for alternative, but they think it was not good for traditional metal. Please check out everything what I'm showing in this video. And I could put hundreds of albums in this video. I mean it. I mean, I have so much 90s stuff. I didn't buy everything in the 90s, but most of the things I bought it when it was released. Because I lived the 90s from all the decades. You know, I am only 42. That's why in the 80s I was young. Of course, in '87, '88 I start becoming a metalhead. But I didn't live the 80s like a metalhead, like a lot of you guys did, you know, because you were 10 years older or 4 or 5 years older. I mean, I was just like, you know, I was 13 or 14 in '87, '88, and I started listening to metal then, you know, and before that it was other music, plus it was like toys I was playing with, you know. But anyway, and series, I remember all the great series that we had before, like Santa Barbara, for example. It was one of my favorite series. But the thing I want to say with this is that, of course, in the 90s, I was not bored with the 80s. Maybe some of you guys that lived all the 80s just became bored you bored of the 80s sounding, and you were happy with grunge, and later with alternative sounds in the metal, and later with industrial and nu metal. Some of you guys maybe were fed up with the 80s, but of course me, I started in 87, 88 into metal. That's why for me everything was still very fresh in 1990, 91, 92, and I wanted this style of music to go on, you know. That's why I dressed like metal. I made my fanzines. You can see some of those old videos of mine where I show my fanzines I made, my Metal Mania fanzines from 91 till 95, and later my God of Thunder fanzines from 96 till nowadays. Just this month my new fanzine came out of God of Thunder number 22. The thing I'm saying is that I love this style, but of course I don't know if what I say makes sense, because of course I lived during the 90s, I lived the 80s, but still nowadays in 2018 I'm living the 80s. I just never got bored of this stuff, you know, because I don't listen only to traditional metal. I also listen to thrash metal, to black metal, to death metal, and maybe that's what was wrong with a lot of people. They were only focused on one style, maybe back in the 80s, and they got bored of that style, and they start listening to stuff outside the metal, you know. But of course if you listen like me to these Deicides, Motley Crue, Saxon, Pretty Boy Floyd and stuff like that, you never get bored with the music. Accept came back in 93, and they also made Predator and Death Row. Those two albums are not perfect, but this one to me is perfect. Great album. Also you had some newer bands coming out, like October 31 with King Foley. I interviewed this guy for one of my fanzines in the 90s. King Foley from Deceased. True metalheads, all the true metalheads. Sacred Steel from Germany. You cannot go wrong with Sacred Steel. Check them out, they're still going strong. Pegasus, I saw them in Germany in 98, touring for this album. Great Australian power heavy metal. This is the best album, I think. Also Metal Lucifer. Never forget about Metal Lucifer when we talk about the mid-90s, late 90s. Metal Lucifer, they were a big influence on many of the bands of the new wave of traditional heavy metal of today. These were true metal maniacs. Skullfuel from the United States. This came out in 97 on RIP Records. Actually RIP Records was the label of King Foley from October 31. Okay, great stuff. Some tapes of bands that were still going strong in the 90s. Extreme, before the singer went to Van Halen. You know, he still did some cool albums. Extreme. Babylon AD, another band that people just forgot about. Gilby Clarke from Guns N' Roses. He did his solo album when he was still part of Guns N' Roses actually. And here we have Axl Rose on, Slash is on it, Duff McKagan is on it. Great album. Even this band went on for a while. I mean, this band actually came back, Journey. See? So 96. Great album, I like this album. Trial by Fire. And Foreigner. Foreigner, yes, they were still around in the 90s. Different vocalist. And here we still have Lou Gramm on it. And here we have a couple of new songs were done for this album. Okay. One tape fell on the floor. Saraya. Not everything was perfect in the 90s. This, for example, Def Leppard, Sting, this was not really a good album, you know. I also show, I think, a video where I show albums I don't really like, and this is one of the albums I don't like. You know, I have it on tape, but no, I don't get in it. And the last band I want to talk about, still, they were traditional hard rock, but they were maybe slammed into the alternative scene, because I don't know, maybe their attitude was like that. Psychon Kick. See, I have 3 albums by them, and they all came out in the early 90s, and they had some good songs on it. It's not the perfect stuff, but they had some good songs on it. Okay, I quickly want to say a couple shout outs. You can subscribe to these guys. I put a link in the video. Dan Powers from Canada. METALBEN's CHRONICLE, amazing. Black Star Vinyl, I'm subscribed to him for a very short time. And the Metal Collector for Denmark. Those 4 guys are amazing. These guys believed in the 90s. You know, they always went on listening to traditional heavy metal, and I salute you for that. And check these guys out, please. It's okay if you changed in the 90s. It's cool you are back now. You know, at least you are back buying records, supporting the scene of nowadays. But please, when you talk about the 90s, traditional heavy metal and hard rock, talk about it with respect. Salute, and stay metal, everybody.